Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Costabile. I have the honor and pleasure of serving as ASME's Executive Director and CEO. And I'd like to welcome you all to ASME's inaugural Policy Impact 2021. This is an exciting way for ASME to offer to our members the opportunity to participate in a new virtual congressional visit program and hear from the leaders in science and engineering policy about key issues impacting the engineering profession today. You'll hear about issues like how do we build for the future? What technologies do we need to meet our national goals? How can we produce what is needed to do so and be efficient in a sustainable way? These questions are part of an ongoing debate in Washington about coming to an agreement on an infrastructure project, how we invest in strategic technologies like batteries and semiconductors, how we invest in the future of our STEM workforce, and most importantly, research infrastructure. And how do we do all of this as we try to bring a global pandemic to a close and restart the economy, and most importantly, get people back to work? I'm very excited to welcome Representative Chrissy Houlahan, who is here to share an engineer's perspective on the innovation agenda in Congress. She's an Air Force veteran, an engineer, an entrepreneur, an educator, and she's continuing her career as the first woman to represent Pennsylvania's 6th district in Congress, which includes all of Chester County in the southeastern Pennsylvania. She earned her industrial degree from Stanford with an ROTC scholarship and launched her service in the U.S. Air Force and the Air Force Reserves. She later earned her MS in Technology and Policy from MIT and is one of just 17 engineers in both the House and Senate in the 117th Congress. Just to elaborate on the diverse experience she brings to Congress, she has been an Air Force officer and missile technology engineer, a Teach for America science teacher, and an education nonprofit founder. She's lived all over the United States as the daughter of a career naval officer, moving 12 times in 12 years. She sits on 3 House committees: Small Business, Armed Services, and Foreign Affairs. And as an example of how she brought her engineering perspective to Congress, she led an effort to examine government holdings of rare earth elements used in the manufacturing and electronics, and offered legislation to sell 3 million pounds of unneeded tungsten from the National Defense Stockpile to private companies. This work was a way to provide access to key materials for manufacturers while offsetting the cost of paid family leave legislation to support more flexibility in our workforce. She's been a champion in Congress for STEM education and workforce development initiatives. She's helped launch Women in STEM Caucus in the House of Representatives, and she's also hosting an ASME Congressional Fellow in her office this year, Cleo McPherson. So we look forward to hearing what's on the science and engineering innovation agenda in the 117th Congress. So without further ado, Congressman Houlahan, good morning and good afternoon. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Tom. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to make sure that before I say anything that I thank you all for Chloe McPherson, who is my fellow, and I couldn't live without her. She has been a remarkable addition to our very small but mighty team here in Washington, D.C. In fact, tomorrow she will be culminating a lot of the work she's been doing on hosting and a conversation with an astronaut, with a lot of our younger people down here on Earth. And I think it's been a remarkable piece of work that I'm looking forward to hosting tomorrow, but really thank you for permitting her to join us and the resources and excellence that she brings to our team. I wanted to say thank you again, Tom, and to the American Society of Medical Engineers for having me here today. As Tom mentioned, I'm Chrissy. I represent Pennsylvania's 6th district in Congress, and to give you a little bit of perspective where that is, it's about 45 minutes west of the city of Philadelphia is where the eastward boundary or border of it starts. It goes westward out to the Lancaster County area. For those of you who know the Amish or have heard of the Amish, that's where a lot of our Amish population lives. And then it goes actually north all the way up to the city of Reading. And if you ever played the game of Monopoly, you know the Reading Railroad was one of the stops along the way. And so this is a really cool district that has the suburbs of Philadelphia, the rural area that it hosts the mushroom capital of our world, as well as a northern area where we have an industrial giant such as Reading, which really could use a shot in the arm in the upcoming infrastructure package. As Tom mentioned, I'm an engineer by training. I did study at Stanford on an ROTC scholarship. The way that the Air Force ROTC works, for those who don't know, is that you come in as a 17 or 18-year-old with an actual degree or engineering degree that they would like you to major in, and mine was industrial engineering. I went on to serve as an engineer in the Air Force, where I focused, as mentioned, in anti-ballistic missile defense programming. After that, I had the awesome opportunity of going to MIT, where I was able to get a degree in technology and policy, and my emphasis was on airframe manufacturing and the supply chain that's related to airframe manufacturing, and trying to understand how we could learn from Japan's automobile manufacturing industry and apply it to the defense industrial complex and the airframe manufacturing industry therein. From there, I was able to come to our area. I've lived here for about 25 years, where I was the operator for a number of different companies and was able to use my supply chain and industrial engineering background in a way that I think many of my classmates, frankly, weren't able to. I was the chief operating officer of a company called And One Basketball, which was a basketball apparel and footwear company. My job there was, of course, to scale the organization to make sure that we had the right logistics and transportation and infrastructure, the right systems, and that were able to allow us to go from basically a very small t-shirt company to a global entity that's sold into 110 different countries across the world. From there, I joined an organization that I think is also relevant to this conversation, which is called B-Lab, which is the nonprofit that supports a concept called a benefit corporation, or B corporations. And this is the idea that our for-profit companies ought to be able to be more than just about the bottom line, that they ought to legally be able to consider more than just shareholders, but also all stakeholders in their decision-making process. And from there, as Tom mentioned, moved on to Teach for America, where I helped teach 11th graders chemistry. And that was a real epiphany for me, because I had the ability within that experience to understand that teaching our young people STEM career fields really depends on them being able to have literacy skills first. And my kids that I was teaching 11th grade to in North Philadelphia were reading largely at the 3rd and 4th grade level, which made it very, very hard for them to embrace some of the concepts that I was trying to teach them in chemistry and high school chemistry. And with that, I was able to join an organization that focuses on exactly that problem, which is early childhood literacy, and making sure that all of our kids have those skills by 4th grade to be able to learn by reading rather than reading to learn. And so that was kind of my journey up until joining Congress. And I've brought all of those different kinds of experiences to bear in Congress. As Tom mentioned, I serve on the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs committees, as well as the Small Business Committee. And I think that that's a really good place for a person with my background to serve. We now have a bunch of questions, both here in Pennsylvania, where I sit right now, and in DC. And the question right now, I hope, is where are we going? Where do we go from here? Both as a community and also as an economy. And the answer to those questions, I know, can't be summed up in the 15 minutes that I have to talk with you all, but I did want to focus on the last piece, which is where is our economy going? And what does the future of work look like for all of us? And as an engineer and an entrepreneur, I do hope that I'm uniquely suited to address some of those questions in the capacity that I'm serving in right now. And frankly, part of the reason why I ran for Congress was because I believed that I have a good set of skills that would lend themselves to policymaking and advocacy on behalf of the people in my community and in our Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and in the country. And I do believe that, unfortunately, there are only 17 of us in the Congress out of 435 who are engineers. And I do believe that engineers have an education and a mindset to identify a problem and to propose solutions. And as much as I appreciate lawyers in our government, I do think there is a very strong place for people with engineering and STEM backgrounds as well. We use data, we use science, we work shockingly collaboratively, and we get things done. And between us, I think that we just frankly need a lot more engineers and people with STEM backgrounds in Congress. So when it comes to rebuilding our economy and realizing a cohesive and collective vision for the future of work, a lot of the discussion right now in Congress is centered around getting people back to work. And of course, that's a priority. But the fact of the matter is that many with pre-pandemic jobs, those jobs don't necessarily exist anymore in the same form that they were a year and a half ago. There aren't those jobs always to return to, which makes the future of debate conversation even more important and paramount right now. So here's an example. I just recently introduced a bill that's called the Ramp for Innovators Act. And this is a bipartisan piece of legislation that will help entrepreneurs access federal support and capital to translate their ideas into commercial and viable products. What this basically translates to is the government has access to capital for entrepreneurs that can help spur innovation, which will of course in turn lead to businesses opening their doors and creating new jobs. But importantly, those entrepreneurs not only need access to capital, but they also need to understand how to protect those ideas through intellectual property protection. They also need to understand how to operationalize those ideas, which frankly is what I've done for most of my life, is taking somebody else's idea and finding a way to scale it, and in some cases to sell it, and hopefully to do that profitably as well. So if we're not talking seriously about innovation and investing in new ideas, then we cannot be talking seriously about jumpstarting the economic recovery post the pandemic. So the time for that conversation is now. People are just saying now, let's get back to work. And those people are missing the larger point that some of that work doesn't any longer exist. So we need to be first and foremost in the business of creating new businesses. And those businesses need to offer jobs that pay a living wage. Those jobs need to be accessible to workers of all skill levels and all backgrounds. And workforce development doesn't just happen in a vacuum. So we need to be thinking about educational opportunities, all kinds of educational opportunities like vocational and technical training, community college, and much more to make sure that we're preparing the workforce of today for those jobs of tomorrow. Education, jobs, innovation, and entrepreneurship are all part of this very same conversation. And as Tom mentioned, we really need to make sure we're not forgetting about how the gender gap in the workforce is widening and has widened even more dramatically during this pandemic. And this is actually something that's particularly acute among those people who are in our STEM fields. I feel like, given that I'm amongst fellow engineers, you will indulge me if I reference a couple of numbers. In the last month of 2020, the US economy lost 140,000 jobs. And I've checked this statistic over and over again because I have a really hard time believing it. But guess how many of those jobs were held by women? 140,000 of them. So women were disproportionately affected, are being disproportionately affected by COVID and the ability to return to work. And even before COVID-19, we know there was a gender gap in the workforce, a gender gap in pay and in numbers. But in a single month, all of these jobs were held by women. That fact is a sobering data point, and I hope that it will serve as a point of inflection and a wake-up call, and understanding that we need to reckon with this disparity and work towards fixing it. And that means talking about accessible and affordable childcare as well, whenever we're talking about jobs. And for me, this conversation is personal because part of the reason I chose to separate from the Air Force was because of a lack of access to affordable childcare on the base that I was serving on. The on-base childcare had a wait list that was 6 months long, and the private options around me were very, very expensive. I was stationed in Boston and were untenable on a military salary. So parents like me are forced to make this kind of decision every day across the country, putting their careers on hold to raise a child. And that's something that we shouldn't be still talking about in 2021. Because raising a family and having a career should not be antithetical to one another. It's in fact what we are here to do. So I've already introduced legislation that hopefully addresses this lack of childcare for service women and servicemen, and I'll continue to work on Congress to address this issue more broadly as well. And I know you've heard this conversation as it relates to the infrastructure package as well. And beyond childcare, we need to be talking about paid family and medical leave. And as Tom mentioned, there's a great deal of movement on this area in particular. Last 2 years ago, we were able to get through paid parental leave for 2.1 million federal employees. And during this pandemic, we have heard countless stories of Americans who have felt sick with COVID, as an example, that didn't have option for paid sick leave. So these programs are as much about jobs as any other issue. Healthcare is part of how we can get people to work too. Far too often, these economic conversations become siloed. We either talk about living wage, or we talk about childcare, or we talk about sick leave, or we talk about the way that we can skill or upskill ourselves. Economists need to focus on numbers while advocating a focus on all of these different areas. The fact of the matter is that they're all part of the conversation. Education and entrepreneurship and gender pay equity, affordable housing, affordable childcare, they're all part of the conversation, and you cannot solve one without the other. So I'm doing my best to do my part here in Congress, from bills, as we've talked about, to organizations such as the first ever, unfortunately, Women in STEM Caucus. 2018 was the first time an organization like that existed. And now I'm proud to say that it is more than 50 members strong and bipartisan. So I'm working to make sure that I bring that engineering sensibility and experience to bear at the table, at the policy writing table, but also I'm working to make sure that people like me are able to bring their experiences as an entrepreneur, or as a businesswoman, or as a mother, or as a teacher, or as a veteran to the table as well. So I and my colleagues, I know, are not just trying to build back an economy, but we're trying to imagine one that is more accessible, more equitable for everyday people in Pennsylvania and beyond. And that means that we have to have a more nuanced conversation, because you just can't say jobs, jobs, jobs all the time, but the jobs and the people who fill them are not going to magically materialize and align with one another. We have to do the work, we have to have the complicated conversations, and we have to think innovatively about a fair future. Thank you. With that, I will yield back to Tom for any questions that you all might have.
Congresswoman, thank you. You're a breath
Thank
of
you.
fresh air. We appreciate you spending a few minutes with us today, and
Thank you.
let us know what we can do. We'll keep the STEM program going. We've got a great program with Discovery Education that ASME is teamed up with. So to me, anytime I get to speak to a bunch of young individuals about engineering is a great day. So
100%. It's
thank
good
you
to
so
be
much.
with you guys.
And also, please thank your staff. They were wonderful working to get this thing together. It was really, truly a breath of fresh air. So thank you.
I will.
Thank
You're
them.
welcome. See you guys later. Bye-bye.